In the late 2000s, a woman named Rebecca Zahau started dating a man named Jonah Shacknai. Jonah is a very wealthy man, being the CEO and founder of Medicis Pharmaceutical Corporation. He brought home millions every single year. Then on July 11th, 2011, Rebecca, her younger sister Zena, and Jonah's son Max were all at Jonah's mansion located in Coronado, California. And this mansion was simply one of his summer homes. Jonah had been in a couple of marriages in the past that did not work out. During the process of one of those divorces, Jonah fought for 3 years to obtain custody over 2 of his kids, Max being one of them. The group of 3 were all getting along well at the mansion when at some point Max had fallen from the 2nd floor down to the 1st. This was a very bad fall. How exactly it happened is debated, but Max had somehow fallen from the handrail, then landed on the handrail of the 1st flight of stairs before falling on his face onto the 1st floor. In the process, Max had also knocked over the chandelier, which was in shambles right next to him. Bones in Max's faces were fractured, and his spine had taken a beating from the fall. Nobody was nearby at the exact moment this happened, but Rebecca would be the first to find Max on the ground after exiting the bathroom when she heard a thud. She screamed for her sister to call 911, and in the meantime, Rebecca tried to tend to Max. However, there was little to be done. He was unconscious, and it seemed as though he wasn't breathing. When medical officials arrived, Max was transported to a hospital, and we'll return to him in just a moment. The very next day, July 12th, Rebecca took her sister Zena to the airport so that she could get on a flight back to Missouri. After saying her goodbyes, Rebecca then had to pick up Jonah's brother, Adam, who had just gotten off a flight from Memphis, Tennessee. After catching up, the two met up with Jonah at a restaurant. Another man known as Howard also showed up. The group spoke about the terrible accident that had occurred with Max, and they were all hoping that he would pull through. After finishing dinner, Rebecca and Adam drove back to Jonah's mansion in Coronado, while Jonah had to visit his son and tend to other personal tasks. You would probably expect that the mansion was quiet that night, as the mood probably was rather somber with Max's condition. However, neighbors later reported that there was loud music playing from the mansion almost all night. Then the next morning, July 13th, around 6:40 a.m., Adam got up from bed and left the guest house that he was staying in to go over to the main mansion. And right as he walked through the doors, his jaw dropped when he found Rebecca completely nude hanging from the balcony. Rebecca's hands along with her ankles had been tied up. Adam rushed to call police and then texted his brother Jonah to inform him of what he just walked into. Rebecca also had a t-shirt wrapped around her head that was used to act as a sort of gag. And instead of waiting for officials to arrive, Adam decided to cut the rope suspending Rebecca himself. When medical officials finally reached the mansion, they determined that Rebecca was long gone, and they made several interesting observations. Amongst them was the sticky residue found on Rebecca's ankles that is left behind from something like duct tape. Then there are the knots that were used to bind Rebecca. These in particular were often seen used by experienced sailors out at sea. While at a glance the scene looked to be a many investigators thought otherwise. They couldn't find any DNA evidence in the area or on Rebecca to prove that it was foul play. But nevertheless, some suspected that it was. So authorities continued to investigate the location to uncover more evidence, which we'll go into further detail later on. But ultimately, investigators deemed that the evidence that they did find did not support the idea of foul play, so Rebecca's death was ruled a During her autopsy, it was revealed that Rebecca had suffered from severe head trauma prior to her death. In fact, there were at least 4 times where her head was struck. However, there are many professionals that don't think it's very likely that Rebecca could have hit her head 4 times in such a position. While all this investigation was going on July 16th, Jonah's son Max was pronounced dead. The injuries he had sustained were just far too severe for him to make a successful recovery. Rebecca's family, understandably, weren't convinced that Rebecca had taken her own life. They suspected that she was murdered, so they requested that an additional autopsy be performed. And during the second autopsy, it was stated by a pathologist named Dr. Cyril Wecht that the damage on Rebecca's throat was much more similar to being strangled rather than being hanged. And then there's the obvious circumstances in which Rebecca was found. She was stripped of all her clothing and her hands and ankles were tied up. However, it was pointed out that in several cases involving the person may decide to tie themselves up ahead of time so that if they change their mind in that split second, they can't actually do anything about it. Then it was proposed that the way the actual bindings were tied, and including the shirt gag that was on her head, all of that couldn't be done by the same person that was being tied up. In response, authorities created a video displaying someone who tied such knots all by themselves. Nevertheless, there are many other details that, when paired alongside the bindings, cause people to stay firm on their stance that Rebecca was murdered. Now back to the actual mansion. If you recall, I said that because of insufficient evidence of a homicide, Rebecca's death was deemed to have been caused by herself. Well, this doesn't mean that there wasn't any evidence found. In fact, when the public learned of what was found at the scene, many of them were 100% convinced that foul play was involved. One such example is the message scrawled on the door to the bedroom that led directly to the balcony. In black paint, the following message was left behind: "She saved him. Can you save her?" Officials initially understood this as a note, while others believed that it was a message left behind from the killer. There were said to be paintbrushes and knives in the area, but all of them only had Rebecca's DNA on them. Rebecca was even known to be a bit of a painter in her free time, but when her family saw the message on the door, they instantly exclaimed that this was not Rebecca's handwriting. When Rebecca's family was interviewed, specifically her sister Zena, she revealed that Rebecca had sent her a text around 10 p.m. the previous night. So whatever happened occurred after that time. Further digging of phone records also showed that Rebecca exchanged messages with a woman named Nina Romano around 10:40 to 11 p.m. Nina is the sister of Jonah's ex-wife named Dina. The message she sent to Rebecca was her saying that she wanted to visit the house so they could have a talk about Max and the accident. However, Rebecca never actually responded to Nina's text. About 2 hours later, Rebecca then opened up a voicemail on her phone. At first, the sender's identity was kept a secret, but it was later shared that it was Jonah who sent it. But the actual contents of the voicemail were never explicitly shared. Authorities simply said that he was discussing Max's condition and how it seemed to be getting worse and worse, and this voicemail was actually later deleted. As the investigation continued, eventually Lieutenant Rich Williams, who worked in the Sheriff's Department's homicide unit, said the following: "We're confident that the initial investigation was handled properly, and we're confident in the science behind our conclusions, the evidence collection, and the work of the lab. After a thorough and comprehensive review of all of the existing evidence and searching for potential new evidence, everything points towards a..." So according to officials, Rebecca really took her own life out of guilt for not being able to save Max. But Rebecca's family was not convinced. One of her sisters was quoted saying, "Becky did not commit suicide. My sister was murdered." They shared that while Rebecca was sympathetic about the situation and felt some level of guilt for not watching Max at all times, she understood that she didn't cause his death. So they went out of their way to hire new attorneys to look back into the case. And one of these attorneys, named Ann Bremner, said this on NBC's Today Show on September 30th, 2011. This was ridiculous on the face of it. And when she said this, she was insinuating something. Jonah's lawyer, Dan K. Webb, came out and responded to Ann Bremner by saying that she was implying Jonah had used money and his status in order to have the investigation end in a manner that he desired. This then led to warnings and threats of defamation and such. And while this has all been going on, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering if Adam Shacknai was ever looked into, because he was the only known person near Rebecca at the time of her death. An investigation was done on Adam and a wrongful death suit was filed against him. This legal battle went on for a very long time, as you would expect, but in April of 2018, a jury actually voted 9-3 that Adam was responsible for Rebecca's death. Rebecca's family was asking for $10 million in the lawsuit, but later agreed on a little over $5 million. However, the very next year, Adam appealed the judgment, stating that there was misconduct amongst the jurors, as well as other errors that skewed the results in the case, and his insurance company agreed to pay out $600,000 instead. Despite this though, Sheriff Bill Gore said that Rebecca's death was an act of... If you are leaning towards the possibility of Adam being responsible, you're going to find that many also believe that Nina and her sister Dina had the potential to also be involved. But both have denied any involvement and have not been proven to have a hand in Rebecca's death either. To this day, nobody has been charged with Rebecca's death, but due to the circumstances, much of the public seems to think that she did not take her own life. Yes, you read that right. This entry is called Jack the Stripper. This case is also commonly referred to as the Hammersmith Nude Murders, and as you can guess from that first name, this series of murders draws some similarities to Jack the Ripper. It's commonly agreed upon that there were at least 6 official victims tied to Jack, but it's also believed that there may be other murders committed by the same person that have not yet been officially linked to these cases. The killer's run spanned between 1959 and 1965 in West London, England. Most, if not all, of the victims in this string of cases shared similarities to each other. These included strangulation, being found naked, victims missing several teeth, and more. Let's begin on the morning of February 2nd, 1964. A man and his dog were on their daily walk near Hammersmith Bridge. The morning seemed mundane like any other, but the peacefulness that a mundane routine brings along is often welcomed. When the man got closer to this body of water, he paused to take in the fresh air and the view. However, during this pause as he's looking around, he makes a disturbing discovery. Right there on the bank is what looks like a nude, unconscious woman. At first, he thought it was actually a mannequin because the area was known for people throwing away their trash into the water. But as he stared at it, it became increasingly obvious that this was a real person. Officials were contacted and they identified the person as a woman named Hannah Tailford. Upon discovery, it was noticed that she was beaten with several teeth missing. Her underwear had also been shoved down her mouth. After some digging into Hannah's past, it was stated that she was a sex worker. Hannah came from a poor family and didn't do all that well in education, forcing her down a less than fortunate path where she survived off of the money she made from work. As news of Hannah's death spread, acquaintances of hers informed police that she had gone missing about a week or so before she was found. Investigators did look deeper into Hannah's death, but they really didn't care all that much. It was almost as if because Hannah was a worker, authorities thought her death was some standard workplace accident, like it was bound to happen and shouldn't be considered a crime. So after they looked at all of the obviouslies, which were very limited, Hannah's case was left to be forgotten. However, little did everyone know that the process of forgetting Hannah was going to prove to be a difficult task, as she is commonly believed to be the first official victim of Jack the Stripper. But as I shared at the start, there may be other victims who aren't officially connected to Jack, but have the potential to be. Fast forward about 2 months to April 8th, the second victim of Jack's was found. This time, it was a woman identified as Irene Lockwood. Similar to Hannah, Irene was also discovered in a body of water, with Irene being found in the river in Chiswick. Another commonality between the two women is that Irene was also stripped of all her clothing, and I didn't share earlier, but Hannah was pregnant when she was found dead, just like 26-year-old Irene. Both women were also workers and had been strangled to death. As a result of all of these similarities between the two cases, investigators would tie Irene to Hannah. They now suspected that they had a serial killer on their hands. About 2 weeks later, yet another body was found. This third victim was 22-year-old Helen Barthélemy, whose lifeless body was found abandoned in an alley. It's often suggested that Jack may have been aware of the growing suspicion that Hannah and Irene were murdered by the same person. So in order to avoid the now heavily surveyed bodies of water in the area, Jack was forced to leave Helen in the alleyway. Authorities quickly determined that Helen was actually new to London and had moved there in order to find work that would lead her down a path of wealth. But this didn't exactly work out for her, and just like with Hannah and Irene, Helen also turned to sex work. Meanwhile, investigators had taken a look at previous crimes that held similar details to the 3 murders that we have just discussed, and they found 2 particularly interesting cases. The first of which involved a 21-year-old worker named Elizabeth Figg. On a cool summer night in the middle of June in 1959, Elizabeth had a client set up that night and was seen stepping inside a vehicle which was also driven by a man. This was the last time anyone had seen her alive. And just like with all the other victims, Elizabeth was found with a majority of her clothing removed and was strangled. Then in November of 1963, the body of 22-year-old Gwyneth Reese was found near a river located in Mortlake. While both of these cases share a ton of similarities to the rest of Jack's murders, they aren't officially connected. But a lot of people believe that they have the potential to be Jack's earliest victims. By the time Helen's body was found, news of Jack the Stripper had spread all over London. Those that were within the local work community grew scared and anxious cause any one of them could be next, and they had no idea who they should be looking out for. And a woman named Mary Fleming would be the next person to encounter Jack. She was 30 years old at the time of her death. Mary's life seemed to be going smoothly a while back. She was married and had 4 children, but her relationship with her husband quickly turned sour and the two split. This led to Mary going into work. Her body was not found in or near a river, but instead on a street in Chiswick on July 14th, 1964. Fast forward about 4 months to November, a 21-year-old named Margaret McGowan was found dead. The primary difference with Margaret and the other victims was that Margaret was found in an area that was much better off than the previous victims. Margaret's main clients consisted of people with a steady or high income, including businessmen and even some powerful politicians. But after asking the residents of the area, investigators realized that Margaret had actually disappeared a while ago, sometime in October, so about a month. She was reported to have been seen getting inside of a Ford Zodiac before disappearing. And up to this point, investigators had no idea what the culprit looked like. But luckily for them, the same witness who had seen Margaret get inside a car was able to provide some details about the man who may very well be responsible for these killings. The information resulted in the following sketch. And that brings us to Jack's last confirmed victim, who was found in February of 1965. Her name was Bridget O'Hara. She too was found about a month after going missing and was also a sex worker. The fact that all of these victims had disappeared prior to being found dead led to investigators concluding that they were being stored somewhere. The discovery of Bridget's body led to a pretty significant lead. It was stated that her body was ever so slightly mummified, which meant that she was likely left somewhere with a heat source. After sweeping the area, authorities determined this heat source to be a transformer. And there is one detail about all of the victims that I have not yet shared. They all had these little pieces of paint on them, and nearby that transformer was a paint shop which contained the exact same paint found on the women. It seemed like officials were on the brink of bringing the killer to justice. But this is where the case seemingly meets a dead end. Any leads after this point proved to either be redundant or just didn't progress the case in any way. And eventually the case went cold, with investigators unable to determine an identity for Jack the Stripper. Investigators believe they were very close to solving the case, going as far as to say that they were confident that they had the name of their killer. Or rather, they had a list of names and they were certain that Jack was amongst the dozen or so people that they had lined up. Amongst those names were Mungo Ireland, Kenneth Archibald, Freddie Mills, and many more. But those names that I just listed are amongst those that are more frequently discussed. Amongst investigators at the time, Mungo Ireland seemed to be the most likely suspect. However, Ireland ended up taking his life in 1965. It's rumored that around the time when Bridget's body was located, Ireland caught wind that he was suspected of being the killer. You see, Ireland worked as a security guard in the same area where Bridget was found. Not only that, but he had access to the paint shop and the transformer during his night shifts, which was a perfect time to drop off the bodies if he were involved. Before his death, he left behind a note that said that he couldn't stick it out any longer. There is debate on whether Ireland meant that he was the killer or if he just couldn't deal with the stress of potentially being framed for the murders. Either way, while some believe Ireland could be Jack, others like to point to the fact that Ireland had a solid alibi, putting him in Scotland during the period in which several of the victims went missing or were found dead. Another suspect that is frequently mentioned is named Harold Jones. Harold has a criminal history, being convicted of murdering 2 girls back in 1921, which got him a life sentence in prison. Prosecutors were aiming for the death penalty, but due to his age, he wasn't eligible for it. He was just 15 years old at the time, and the murders of those 2 girls share some details that are the same with the Hammersmith murders. The girls' names were Frida Burnell, who was 8 years old, and Florence Little, who was 11, both of whom were lured by Harold to locations where nobody was around. About 2 decades into his sentence, Harold was released and was seen by several people in southwest London around the late 40s and early 50s. Harold later got married and raised a family around Hammersmith in the 60s. However, it should be stated that Harold is only a recent suspect. During the height of the crimes, Harold was never really looked into by investigators. It was only in the last couple of decades when investigators and researchers stumbled upon Harold and tied him to the killings. Now, it's entirely possible that I'm seeing things, but if you ask me, the sketch and Harold are pretty similar. As most of you know, these police sketches are often exaggerated, so particularly particular details can stick in people's minds. The sketch shows a man with really pronounced and sharp ears, which you can kind of see in Harold. There's also the clean comb-backed haircut, but obviously the similarities could very well just be coincidence. And another detail many like to point to is that all of the Hammersmith victims were of a similar build. They were all rather short, skinny, just overall very small women. Those that suspect Harold believe that he only targeted smaller women because this was a fetish or interest he developed from killing those two girls back in his teenage years. However, it should be stated that Frida and Florence didn't show any signs of assault, but without definitive evidence to back this route up, it's impossible to say if Harold was indeed Jack.